Dear you, the thing about a storm is that there is no denying its destructive capacity and the very fact of its arrival. When it comes, people take cover, look for shelter. There are announcements on the news, on television, on the radio. Blaring alarms sent over mobile networks startle you into action to communicate the urgency of a disaster. But this same response is not always available to us when we consider our mental health and our lived experience. There's a lot of doubt, shame, and hesitation. Before we start with the discussion, if there are topics that make you feel uncomfortable, you may take your time outside of this space. And if you need help that is urgent, you may reach out to the NCMH Crisis Hotline as shown in your screens. We pick up right where we left off. Just a reminder of what we've covered so far in this module. This module discusses self-stigma and mental health. We understood what mental health conditions are. For this video, we'll talk about instances of self-stigma. We'll now continue our in-depth discussion of self-stigma. For this lesson, we will discuss the following topics: types of stigma, self-stigma, how to eliminate stigma. The stigma attached to mental health issues, according to the World Health Organization, is one of the main obstacles to the need for mental health care. People with mental health issues face widespread discrimination and stigma on a global scale. Stigma can also be defined as a deeply discrediting attribute that transforms someone from a whole and a normal person to a tainted, discounted one. They can also be described as stereotypes or unfavorable assumptions that are made about a particular person or group when their behavior is deemed to be out of character with what the society considers normal. There are different types of stigma: perceived stigma, experienced stigma, and self-stigma. Often, when we experience stigma, it is not only at a personal level or through individuals who stigmatize what we go through and our experiences. When you experience stigma, you may experience it at different levels, which may also affect the intensity of its effect on you as an individual. Understanding how some types of stigma emerge at the institutional level and reflect economic, political, and historical forces is made possible by structural models of stigma. For instance, you might not be able to get opportunities like a job or a government post due to your mental health problem, or you might even get fired from a job due to your condition. In their definition of perceived or felt stigma, labels state that it involves the fear of enacted stigma, but also encompasses a feeling of shame associated with the illness. People are frequently stigmatized as deviant in their communities. For example, you may think that all Filipinos believed that once you have a mental health condition, you are baliw. This is perceived stigma. You may have not yet experienced discrimination, but this is how you perceive people will perceive you. Van Brakel and colleagues define experienced stigma as the experience of actual discrimination and/or participation restrictions on the part of the person affected. Discrimination extends not only to how society treats these individuals, but also to the conditions in which they live, mental health budgets, and the priority that we give these services. Stigma in the workplace refers to the severity to treat someone with a mental illness unfairly. The refusal to hire people with mental illnesses, the restriction of opportunities, the lack of equity in workplace policies, engagement, and social interactions are all examples of discrimination. It might be easier to spot or acknowledge stigma when another person performs these acts. But stigma may also be experienced in the way that people with lived experience are allowed to live and move through the world. When you ask for help after a storm or during a typhoon, calls for aid and rescue, calls to contribute to relief efforts, or even simply checking in on people who live in affected areas, we might find that the same courtesy is not immediately or naturally extended to our internal storms, to our experience of difficult mental health conditions, uncaring policies, or even the refusal to allot resources like budget, projects, programs, and activities, or other initiatives around mental health all contribute to experienced stigma. The stigma associated with mental health issues is global, permeating all cultures and circumstances worldwide. Families, neighbors, and even health professionals themselves may stigmatize those who have mental health disorders. Self-stigma is the term for when people internalize negative messages and stereotypes and apply them to themselves. Stigmatization of those who work in the mental health field is widespread and can affect the availability of qualified personnel in these systems. The internalization of this public stigma is what Corrigan and Watson refer to as self-stigma. They describe public stigma as the ways in which the general public stigmatizes people with mental illnesses. According to Corrigan, self-stigma is defined as the reduction of a person's self-esteem because the person believes themselves to be someone who is socially unacceptable. Public stigma is the perception held by a group or society that an individual is socially unacceptable and typically shows negative reactions towards them. Sadly, stigmatization can come from both the individual and external sources. We refer to stigma that comes from an individual as self-stigma because it is an internalized form of stigma that can affect one's sense of guilt and inadequacy. The fear of being judged and labeled frequently causes this type of stigma and has an impact on an individual's well-being. Internalized or self-stigma also refers to the notion that having a mental illness becomes part of one's identity and is linked to incompetence and the lack of ability to recover. For example, in the workplace, questions regarding the validity of mental health conditions are brought up, and some co-workers could draw comparisons between mental health conditions and physical illnesses. As a result, they have little confidence in the abilities of mental health professionals to identify mental health issues and offer workplace advice. They often dismiss mental health conditions, as it is not readily visible as physical illnesses are. Employees may believe that people who are suffering from mental health issues will take advantage of them to gain special privileges, even if they look fine. Employees with mental health issues may internalize unfavorable self-perceptions, which can significantly impair their work performance and sap their drive. They might also have a tendency to put off receiving help or therapy in order to escape the stigma-related social rejection. It should be stressed that delaying therapy can have negative consequences that impact how well one functions. With the right support, the majority of persons with mental health conditions are able to retain outstanding relationships and do well at work, functioning at a very high social and economic level. In summary, self-stigma is a major problem that affects all serious mental health problems globally and in all geographical locations, and it is associated with poor clinical and functional results. Increased anti-stigma efforts and the creation of recovery-oriented practices in mental health facilities are urgently required because the prevalence of stigma in the public and among mental health professionals is a significant predictor of self-stigma. Mental health is a double-edged sword. People must contend on the one hand with the signs and limitations that keep them from achieving many of their life objectives. On the other hand, the stigma associated with mental illness limits their opportunities and aspirations even more. Stigma and prejudice can be reduced in the community through anti-stigma interventions, particularly social contact strategies that enlist the assistance of persons with lived experience in modifying attitudes and behaviors. That's why you are important. The World Health Organization's Mental Health Gap Action Program provided some do's and don'ts for combating stigma against mental health. Some of the do's are listed below. Using courteous language, highlighting one's skills rather than limits, referring to the person rather than the handicap, and informing others when they exhibit stigmatizing behavior are all ways we can fight stigma. Remember, it's acceptable to inform someone about their stigmatizing behavior if they have demonstrated it. On the contrary, these are the things that one should not do. Successful persons with impairments shouldn't be seen as the exception. Avoid using general terms like mentally ill and retarded. Furthermore, refrain from using terms like baliw, depressed, or bipolar in casual conversations that are obviously associated with mental health problems conditions. It's clear to you now that mental well-being and your mental health is much more concretely a shared responsibility, one that is borne by you as an individual, the community to which you belong, and the larger nation or society in which you reside. Even if you yourself are able to spot changes in your behavior and other warning signs that come with experiencing mental health conditions, greater and more systemic forces are at play that may make it difficult to seek help and receive it. Stigma may be perceived, experienced, and inflicted on yourself as self-stigma, whereas perceived stigma includes intense feelings of shame around the mental health condition. This kind of stigma also describes how you think members of your community, your family, people at school or work might perceive you as deviant or different. Experienced stigma is the experience of actual discrimination, which are actions and behaviors that may result in the maltreatment of people with lived experience. You might have experienced stigma in the workplace, or you may have encountered policies and rules that enact stigma at a larger level. Self-stigma, on the other hand, is internalized and may result in feeling guilty and in feeling inadequate as a result of your lived experience. Self-stigma may hinder your capacity to look for or feel deserving of help when you need it most. You should remember that what you are going through is always deserving of acknowledgement. But no matter how hard you believe this yourself, it also takes a village, a community to provide this help for you. This is why it's important to address stigma at the community and systems levels. Nagmamahal, you. Before we continue with our next lesson, let's see what you learned in our module. For this module, you are tasked to create a reflection paper answering this question. What are the stigma I am holding against? The instructions are posted in our learning management system. I'll see you in our next module.